We now turn our attention to business cycles, more precisely to shocks that can be transmitted across countries. Remember our lecture about business cycle accounting? Shocks to the economy can appear as deviations from equilibrium of the four equations that define the equilibrium business cycle model, namely total factor productivity and the production function, the labor wedge and the labor leisure choice, the investment wedge and the Euler equation, and finally the government wedge and the aggregate resource constraint. What this table shows is that for 22 OECD countries in the period between 1970 and 2011, the correlation between the distance between two countries and the strength of the correlation between each pair of wedges is negative in 81 out of 88 cases. Geographical distance is a key factor in the transmission of shocks. And also that for total factor productivity, denoted in the table as omega A, most correlations are larger and statistically significant. This seems to suggest that trade is a relevant force in shaping these linkages between business cycles across different economies. Let us start by laying down the assumptions on the conditions under which the domestic economy can trade with the rest of the world. We assume that there are no barriers or costs to trade across national borders. This assumption naturally leads to the law of one price. If there are no costs to trade, then in equilibrium the prices of the domestic economy must be equal to the prices in the rest of the world. Suppose not. Let us consider a situation where a good is cheaper outside of the domestic economy. Then all domestic consumers would buy the good from abroad, thus making the price of the good abroad rise and the price of the good at home fall in the process. Hence, in equilibrium, all prices must be equal. This is also true for the credit markets. Same arguments apply. Therefore, when ignoring inflation, there will also be an equalization of the nominal and real interest rates. Now that the economy is open to the rest of the world, there will be nominal holdings of foreign assets by the home country and vice versa. Let BF be the net nominal holdings of foreign assets by the home country. Part of these assets are in the form of physical capital. The ownership of this physical capital located abroad is called foreign direct investment. The net real holdings of foreign assets generate some income that is given by the return on those assets, RT-1, times BFT-1 divided by P. So now the total real income of domestic residents is the sum of real GDP, Y, and the net real asset income from abroad, R times BF divided by P. This is called the real gross national product, GNP. Finally, every period, domestic residents can adjust their real foreign assets position by selling or buying foreign assets. The change in the net foreign asset balance is called net foreign investment and is equal to BFT minus BFT minus 1, all divided by P. This means that the domestic country can now consume or invest more than its domestic production by borrowing from abroad in the form of negative net foreign investment. Real domestic expenditure plus net foreign investment is equal to real GNP. Thus, private consumption, CT, plus investment, IT, plus government spending, GT, plus net foreign investment, BFT minus BFT minus 1 divided by P, is equal to GDP YT, plus real net asset income from abroad, RT minus 1, times BFT minus 1 divided by P. Rearranging this identity, one can get the balance of payments identity, whereby the real capital and financial account, BFT minus 1 divided by P, is equal to the real current account. The real current account is given by the trade balance, exports XT minus imports MT, that can be derived from YT minus CT minus IT minus GT plus the real net asset income from abroad. Hence, the capital and current account are two sides of the same coin. While the current account tracks all transactions between the domestic economy and abroad in the form of goods and services, the capital account tracks transactions that imply changes in ownership of assets. If the current account balance is greater than zero, we say that we have a current account surplus. If it is negative, we have a current account deficit. Let's take a look at the data on some of the objects we have just defined. In this plot, we look at the current account as a fraction of GDP for the UK from 1772 to 2014. We see that the current account was mostly positive before 1900, before turning highly negative during World War II. Moreover, it has been mostly negative in the last decades and trending downwards since 1975. We know from our model definition that this downward trend in the current account could have stemmed from a declining trade balance or a declining net income from abroad, or both. In figure 18.2, we see that while the trade balance has been negative, it shows no particular trend. Hence, it seems that the current account behavior we saw previously is not entirely explained by the trade balance. Next, in figure 18.4, we see that in fact the net income from abroad in UK trends upward. Hence, it cannot definitely explain the negative trend in the current account. So what explains it? It turns out it is something we did not include in the model that is however measured in the data: transfers. In figure 18.5, we clearly see that net transfers are negative and trend downward since 1975. Finally, going back, we see in figure 18.3 that the net foreign investment mimics the current account behavior just as predicted by the identity. We now move away from time series data to check how current account varies across countries. As we can see in the map, there are huge imbalances in the current accounts across countries. For instance, the US had the world's largest current account deficit in 2017, while Germany had the world's largest surplus. While these imbalances are certainly reasonable during a certain amount of time, they become a problem when they become persistent. When they are persistent, oftentimes they generate tensions and some retaliation in the form of protectionist measures such as tariffs. But in order to solve these current account imbalances in an effective way, it is crucial to understand what determines the current account. What we will show next is that the current account deficit or surplus can actually be a symptom of many different causes. The first example of determinant of the current account are domestic and foreign interest rates differential, if the economy were closed to the rest of the world. Suppose that the real interest rate that would prevail in the home country, if it were closed, is greater than the rate in the rest of the world. In this case, opening up the home country would lead to a current account deficit, because the home country would borrow from the rest of the world in order to finance higher net domestic investment. If the real interest rate in the home country that would prevail had it been closed was lower than the rest of the world, then the opposite would be true, as the home country would finance foreign investment in detriment of domestic investment. Next, we show that economic fluctuations, as those originated by TFP shocks, can also be a determinant of the current account balance. If the domestic economy experiences a positive TFP shock, the marginal productivity of capital will increase, which means domestic investment will rise as its return becomes more attractive. At the same time, because domestic GDP increases, consumption will increase. As seen many times before during the course, how much it will rise depends on the persistence of the TFP shock. If it is persistent, then consumption C will increase in the same rate as GDP Y. Hence, national savings remain the same, which means that all the increase in domestic investment will be financed with foreign savings. This means that the domestic country will face a current account deficit. On the other hand, if the TFP shock is transitory, the increase in C will be less than proportional to the increase in Y, which means real national savings increase. Hence, the final effect of the increase in domestic investment relative to the increase in real national savings on the current account balance could be ambiguous. However, since the real interest rate is now fixed and equal to the real interest rate in the rest of the world, it turns out that the increase in domestic investment relative to the same TFP shock is now much larger than in a closed economy. Consequently, there will be a deficit in the current account even if the TFP shock is only transitory. Hence, we predict that the real business cycle model in an open economy predicts that the real current account balance will be countercyclical. The data showed in the next figure seems to align well with this prediction. Let us now consider an example where GDP drops or increases by some random event that does not change the technology and thus the return on capital. For instance, harvest failures. Because of bad weather, suppose that there is an harvest failure which makes GDP drop. Since the drop in GDP is transitory and there is no change in the return on investment, there will be little adjustment in consumption C and investment I, which means that the country will face a current account deficit. However, in contrast to the positive TFP shock, the deficit in the current account will be a symptom of bad economic times. Hence, a key message of all of these examples is that the current account balance can represent a symptom of many different causes. So economic policy should not be decided in response to the current account balances, but rather to what causes said balances. We turn on to how government decisions can affect the current account. In the model without frictions we are considering, increases in government spending G lead to a fall in national savings, thus to a current account deficit. Government deficits at the same time do not translate to the current account deficits if Ricardian equivalence holds, because national savings are unchanged. However, if the Ricardian equivalence does not hold, then households do not save the full amount of the tax cut and national savings fall. In this case, a government budget deficit leads to a current account deficit. This case is often called a twin deficit situation. Finally, we also point out that even expectations can play a role in determining the current account balance. For instance, if there are high economic growth prospects, the return on capital is high, which attracts foreign capital. As a consequence, a domestic economy will experience a current account deficit. As a final example of a determinant of the current account balance, we take a closer look at changes in terms of trade. The terms of trade is the ratio P over PF, which translates to how many foreign goods a domestic resident can get per unit of domestic goods. An improvement in the terms of trade, P divided by PF, implies that the home country is better off. It can now get more imported goods per unit of exported goods. That is, home goods become more valuable relative to foreign goods. If the terms of trade deteriorate, we get the opposite result. It turns out that the effects of changes in the terms of trade are similar to that of TFP shocks. For simplicity and clearer exposition, let us assume that all goods that are produced domestically are exported and that all expenditures are imported from abroad. The nominal current account becomes BFT minus BFT minus 1 equals P times YT plus RT minus 1 times BF minus PF times expenditure, which is CT plus IT plus GT. Let us now define the current account in real terms in foreign goods. To do that, just divide the nominal current account by the price of foreign goods. It becomes clear that the terms of trade show up as a term multiplying domestic output. Hence, changes in the terms of trade will indeed mimic changes in A in terms of its impact on output. As a consequence, an increase in the terms of trade will have the same effects by rising output and with it consumption. The more permanent it is the change in the terms of trade, the more consumption will respond and the less national savings will change. In addition, the terms of trade will also affect the return on capital. Because the domestic investor buys investment goods at PF to sell output at P. So the higher is the terms of trade, the more incentives it has to invest. Hence, if the change in the terms of trade is permanent, the current account will be in a deficit, as national savings do not change while investment increases. And even if the change in the terms of trade is temporary, domestic investment will tend to react more, just as in TFP shocks, thus leading to a current account deficit. However, if there are high capital adjustment costs, as in oil-producing countries, then it is perfectly possible that investment adjusts less than national savings when the change in the terms of trade is temporary. This is exactly what happens when we look at oil exporting countries around the world. In periods of improvements of the terms of trade, these countries experience large current account surplus. We end this lecture by noting that the model laid out does not speak to trade volume, that is, the absolute value of exports and imports. It only speaks to trade balance. To explain trade volumes, one needs to turn to theories of international trade as those discussed in the previous lecture.